Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. Today's episode is part 2 of a conversation with Andrew Bauman. We ended part 1 a couple weeks ago reflecting on the claim that if we engage our own stories of heartache with kindness, then space will be created for grief to bubble up, and grief brings healing to the broken portions of our hearts. Today, we go into much more depth about the whole question of what does it mean to actually grieve our wounds. If you enjoy my conversation with Andrew, you might want to either pick up a copy of his forthcoming book, which is entitled Stumbling Toward Wholeness, or you may want to spend 37 minutes watching his beautiful film, A Brave Lament, which is also available on Amazon. We talk about both the book and the film today. I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, we are back with Andrew Bauman from Seattle. Andrew, it's good to see you again.
You as well. Always good to see your face.
Say a little bit about the film A Brave Lament, which has been released since we last spoke. Just a little bit about what it is.
Yeah, we released a film and a book called A Brave Lament. And so it basically chronicles our journey 6.5 years ago of losing our firstborn son, Brave. And it was a tragic, horrific cord accident in my wife's womb, and right before the day he was born. And so it just chronicles that time and our survival of that time. And so the writing of the book is really wrestling with our faith in that first year after that, and just the tragedy. And the film chronicles a longer period of time, basically our, the funeral, and then how we survived with our community, and basically giving permission to people to grieve, which is a wild concept that we have to give people permission to break open their lives. And yet that's what we've found out journeying into people's grief is that we need permission to truly be ugly in our grief and let it all hang out. No matter if it's a loss of a child, loss of a parent, anything that we love, we must grieve to the level in which we loved. And that's the only way healing happens.
And the film, I saw it this week. It's available for our listeners. You can get it on Amazon. I think you can get it. Where else can you get it?
You can buy it or rent it on Vimeo on demand. So you can watch it online, or you can watch it for free on Prime.
Okay. And it is a stunning piece of art.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I want to talk about it in this podcast, but I kind of want to start somewhere else, because you've also got this book coming out called Stumbling Toward Wholeness.
Yeah, September 18th, a new book with Nav Press and Tyndale coming out. So I'm really excited about that.
There's a section in Stumbling Toward Wholeness. There's a chapter called Grieving Our Wounds.
Yes.
And there's a sentence in there that really struck me. I want to just reflect on it with you. It says, grief always exposes who we are.
Mm-hmm.
It's a magnifying glass that enlarges our greatest failings, our fullest glory, and who we are meant to be. That's a prophetic sentence in Western American contemporary culture. Grief always exposes who we are. Say a bit about that.
I think what I've seen is when great loss happens, when horrific things happen, it reveals so much. And so it depends on the work you've already done, the internal healing you've already done. If you lose great, if you face incredible tragedy, like if you haven't done any emotional work, you're not going to be able to enter that grief very well. You're not going to be able to grieve very boldly. You are going to just kind of stumble into grief and not really know what to do with it because it's a foreign concept. If you've done a lot of heart work, transformation work, grief will come natural. It's a second language because you've already been grieving your wounds for years and years and years. And so that's kind of what I mean by that, is it exposes who we already are. Like, what work have you done? Where are you in your healing journey? And grief will really expose that.
And for a lot of people, I mean, in our culture, grief, like you said at the beginning, we need permission to grieve. It's one of the most natural inclinations of the human heart, and yet in our culture, it's borderline anathema, at least in the church.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I remember this. Oh, it was just so painful to be a part of. Lost my sister-in-law almost 2 years ago now. And it was horrific cancer. We thought she was in remission, and then it came back, and within a month she was gone. I remember at her funeral, and I spoke at the funeral and opened up with a quote from one of my favorite quotes from Rumi: "The wailing of broken hearts is the doorway to God." And then the pastor came up briefly after, and he just started saying that we shouldn't be crying. There's no tears. She's in heaven. Let's celebrate. And I just cried louder. I just tried to wail louder. It was just like, no, like, do not take me away from grieving my sister who I love so much. Don't try to hinder me. Don't try to suppress my grief. Grief is good. Grief is holy. God is in the grief. And yet it's so common to try to say, no, don't cry. I'm not crying because she's in heaven. I'm crying because she's not here with me. I'm crying because she's not here with me, and I loved her.
Yes.
That's what we have to wrestle with, this commonality where somehow in our church culture, in our society, grief has been like this thing that you don't do if you're a good Christian. And I would argue the exact opposite.
And not without biblical precedent. Like, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted.
Yes.
And really, Isaiah 61, which Jesus quotes at the outset of his ministry, and the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to heal the brokenhearted. And just a few verses later, to comfort those who grieve, to comfort those who mourn. In my mind, a brave lament, it's a lot of things, but it is prophetic. And in this sense, the scene, the scene that moves me the most from that film is there's a portion of at his memorial service, and you are on the ground wailing. Yeah. But you're not merely on the ground, you're reaching. Your hand is reaching up, and it is touching his white coffin.
Yeah. I remember that now as you say that, just in my body, of not wanting him to be alone and wanting to continue to hold him, and obviously not being able to. And so just, the whole, however long that service was, an hour long, I just kept my arm there just because I didn't want him not to be held.
It was just a holy moment in that film to see you reaching out and touching this boy's coffin. And now to hear you say the reason you did not want him to be alone. I mean, that goes to the core, not just of a father's heart, but of us as human beings. Like, we're created to be in connection. And this boy, listeners, you have to see the film, because the way the film happens, like at the beginning, you get a sense of just how connected you and your wife, Christy, are to this boy.
Yeah.
Like this boy is very alive before he comes out of the womb. Yeah.
Our excitement was just, I couldn't even, it was our first son. And literally it was like, the king was coming home, it was just like, it was this grand entry. And so it was just, we were inviting the king in to live in our little basement apartment. The excitement and our naivety, we were just so naive and so wildly excited about welcoming our little king home.
And so when I say prophetic, what I really mean about the film being prophetic is that by your very presence in the film and your wife's, you're inviting us, you're calling us to grieve our losses, and to do so bodily, intentionally, and persistently.
Yes. Yeah. And a big theme in the film is creating rituals around our loss. And one thing that we do a lot of is we market because it matters. And so one thing that we don't do a lot is we don't just think like this matters, even small things, not huge things like the loss of a child, but just small things. Like, can you market? Can you create a ritual that marks and says this matters?
Yes.
This is a big deal. And I'm not just going to go on throughout my day. And for us, after losing Brave, we were able to have some help financially from family. We closed our private practices. We traveled Southeast Asia for 4 months. We felt more comfortable in other countries that were more, comfortable with grief. And so we did a pilgrimage in Vietnam, and, we did these things to try to like make more sense of our heartache. And we wrote every day. And that's where the Brave Lament book came from, is just our everyday writings of survival, of trying to make sense of the senseless.
Yes. And expressing what's inside and getting it down either on paper, in conversation, but getting it out, getting what's in out.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, the film is a gift in so many ways, but one of the gifts I think is it gives permission for the rest of us to feel our pain and to grieve it, not just outwardly, but publicly. And I don't mean in front of the general public, but you and Christy are very much doing this with your community, in front of your community, your friends.
Yes.
It's almost a countercultural experience to watch, because it's like, oh my gosh, there are communities that can bear with this level of anguish. And I'm sure it was an imperfect experience for all, but there was a bearing with of your agony.
And we know that's not normal, right? We know that people watching this are going to, watching our film, like, wait, I don't have that. And you probably don't. And realizing what we have is very special. It's not normal. And so to use our experience as something normal. And yet what we hope is that the film shows, like, we've got to suffer together. We can no longer hide. And so if you can't find those people in your life, like, maybe you need some new friends. Like, we have to lay our mask down and start showing our humanity and bless our humanity, rather than pretending, rather than churches just being, a social club. Like, we got to let our wounds show.
You might say that you had no choice, given the severity of your anguish, but to weep and wail in front of your friends. But at some level, there was choice involved in you and Christy continuing to let yourselves be known where you were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there was a point where I didn't care, right? Like, I just did not care. I had to have integrity, and I had to be true to what I lost, right? And I had so many hopes and dreams. And I remember somebody, I think I shared this on the film, somebody had sent me an email right after and said, God told me you're going to have another son.
Yes, yes.
And I was just like, I was so pissed. And just like, don't tell me I'm going to have another son. I don't care about it. I don't care about a son I don't know. I want my son that I lost. Be with me in the pain. Be with me in the heartache. Don't shoot towards the future. Be with me now. And that's how we accompany those who grieve. And that's what we can all learn of. How do we accompany those who are hurting? And I think that's a lost art, especially in the church, of how we accompany those who grieve.
You wrote a poem that you put in the book, Stumbling Toward Wholeness. And is it okay if I just read back to you some of your poem?
Please do.
It's starting in the middle, so that's a little unfair, but I just want to focus on this part of it. You're talking about this very subject of what you need in the midst of deep grief. And,
yes.
and it goes like this: just touch me. Will you hold my hand? Though it's cold and bony, will you embrace me tightly? Can you wail as I wail, curse as I curse, pray as I pray? I don't want to be fixed. I want to be known.
Yeah, I remember writing those words almost 10 years ago, and how I just still refer to them as a prayer, because it comes from my own heartache. It comes from a place when many of my friends, their parents are still together, or they just hadn't experienced much suffering, and where I was experiencing a lot of suffering, and I felt so alone, and people just didn't get it.
Yes.
There's a club, right, where we have a big S on our chest of sufferer, and it's like you almost know who's in the club or not just by their presence. And so there's an art, and I unfortunately have the burden of now for the rest of my life trying to teach that art of how to accompany those of us who suffer, because I know what it's like to be completely missed by people who are really good intentioned. It's not like they're bad people. It's not, but they just don't know how to suffer well because, they haven't either suffered yet, or they just don't know what that's like.
And the poem, I mean, in so many ways, it's a plea for someone to simply be with you where you are.
Exactly.
And I mean, I can't just, as a pastor, I can't help think about just this theologically in terms of Emmanuel, God with us. Like you're not asking for a lot here.
Yes and no, right? Yes and no, because I actually want you to die. Like I'm actually asking you to completely lay down everything and feel completely foolish and futile. So in that way, I'm asking everything. And in another way, it's like, no, just lay by my bedside and shut your mouth.
So let me finish the poem, or at least continue a little bit, because you stepped into it. I'm asking you to die. So the poem continues. I want your presence, kneeling by my bed, feeling useless, powerless, helpless. Yes, for then you will understand a small part of me that few have had the courage to know. I recognize this will cost you greatly, but deep down I will learn my worth from the measure of your sacrifice.
Come on.
Yes and no. You are asking them to die.
Exactly.
I hope everyone can hear the ripples of the gospel in this. Jesus saying, calling his disciples, look, you're going to have to follow me, which means to suffer and to die. And that's what the poem is. It is a plea for others to sit next to you and to die.
Yeah. And this is, I think, what it fully means to die to ourselves. We think it's just somehow sin management. No, I think it's much fuller than that. No, it means, dying to having answers.
Yes.
Dying to try to fix other people. Like that's what it means. Like dying to ourselves so we can suffer alongside those who are suffering.
And for me to let my body be present next to you in that level of anguish is overwhelming.
Yes, exactly.
And yet there's no way for resurrection to exist for either of us apart from that.
Yes, well said.
And so it's really clear from the film that though you did not have everyone, you had some who actually did that. Yes,
totally. Exactly. And that's what made us, again, we were able to survive. We were loved well, held well. We were able, and again, we have the privilege and we had financial help to be able to, I know everyone doesn't have that. Some people have to go to work the next day.
Yes.
And it's just like, that's where our privilege, where we were able to take time off and feel it. And yet I'd ask you, even if you do have to go back to work, will you create some type of space, even if it's not a trip around the world? Like, will you create some type of internal space to let it matter, to create a ritual, to really enter into the pain, even if it's just in your bed at night, feeling it with intention? Because if you don't, it comes out sideways, right? It'll come out through addiction. It'll come out through numbness. It'll come out through passive aggressive comments. It'll come out through these other ways, sideways. And it's not healthy. That's not wholeness.
And so that reminds me of, you begin one of the chapters in the book with a Barbara Brown Taylor quote where she says, sadness does not sink a person. It is the energy a person spends trying to avoid sadness that does that.
I love that quote. Yeah.
And that's what I'm hearing you put language to, is that contrary, because inside it feels like if I go into the pain, I'll never come back. If I start crying, I'll never stop.
Exactly. People are afraid that it's going to overtake them.
Yes.
right? And so I use a metaphor often about kind of like a terrifying monster. All right. So it's coming to your door. And what do we do normally with that terrifying monster comes to the door? We run to the door. We bolt it shut. We take hammer and nails and we put boards across it. We shove the couch up against the thing and we run in the corner. And if we do that, the monster continues to control us. We're hiding in the corner, right? We're terrified. We're scared because the monster still controls us. What happens if grief comes to our door and we invite it to come into our home? We have a seat with it on the couch and we say, hey, I've got 10, 15 minutes to have a conversation with you, and then you have to go. You can come back tomorrow. You can come back another day, but I'm still in control. I still have power. But why are you here? Well, how can I help? How can I help you? And then see you later. Like, I'm still in control of you. I will not let my monster rule me.
Yeah, it's really the notion of hospitality. I mean, can I welcome at the table this part of me that is full of anguish, full of agony, and even the part of me that is afraid to let the agony in? Can I welcome that part of me at the table for a short period today?
Yes. And that's true for anything, not just grief. Right? Can we become intimate with our shame? Can we become intimate with our self-hatred? Can we become intimate with all parts of us without that judgment, without that contempt, without those parts of us where shame rules us? I want us to become intimate with all parts of who we are.
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing you say is it's the welcome of Jesus.
Yes. Isn't that... if we look at my books, The Stumbling Towards Wholeness, I go through the story of the prodigal the whole way through. And it's like that, the welcoming. Can you embody the Father in yourself? Can you embody the Father because you are also the runaway? You are also the prodigal son. You are also the entitled elder brother. Like, we are all three of these. Embody the Father towards your own self. Embody the Father.
You're talking about welcoming parts of ourselves that perhaps are wounded, perhaps feel younger, but they are parts that we are not comfortable with.
Yes.
And whether that is parts that are buried in grief or shame or self-hatred, you're talking about welcoming and really what I'm hearing you invite us to is, will you let that part of you speak some words? Yes,
definitely. Yes. And isn't that unconditional grace? Like, isn't that what grace is? Unconditional mercy, like, towards ourselves. And I don't care if you were the victim of abuse, if you were the perpetrator of abuse, God's love covers both. All of that. Right? And yet we take the seat of God and we try to annihilate ourselves, whether we're the victim or perpetrator of abuse, and we try to annihilate ourselves to clean ourselves, to forgive ourselves. And we are not God. And so what does that mean to begin to embody God's voice, this unconditional love that's radical and actually will make people mad if you actually do it? That's the role of the gospel. And it's scandalous. And it doesn't feel right, and it shouldn't.
I want to come back to a grief in a minute, but there's another chapter, a chapter called Engaging Kindness. And in this chapter, you talk about not just welcoming the younger you, but blessing that boy. And you talk about it in the context of a photograph of you and your dad when you're probably five or 6 years old. And I won't read the whole section, but just kind of to summarize it. In the photo, his arms are reaching towards you as you run away in joy, kind of being chased by him.
Yes.
And you find this photograph, as an adult. You look at it and it's hard to look at it, and you long to look at it, and you long to believe that the laughter on our faces was real, is how you put it, that my father loved me. Did this picture capture his longing to be in relationship with me? Or was this one of the only moments when father and son would ever truly be father and son? And then you go on and you talk about God kind of using that photograph just to call you into what I would say is a welcoming posture towards that boy.
Yeah. Since the story of my father in my own life isn't necessarily one of affirmation, right? In many ways, he allowed his own woundedness to take him away from me. I have to begin to develop a father's voice within myself. I have to learn to reparent these wounded places and allow the Father's voice to become and God the Mother's voice to become very integrated with how I parent myself. And so I imagine myself taking my father's place and creating a new voice of peace and love over that little boy, and not condemnation, but deep love. And imagine I wrote that however long ago that was, but 30, however old I was, to hold that little boy. And for me to be a good father to him, because I have also been a cruel father to my little boy, and I don't want to be anymore.
In the book, you say this: over the years since entering that photo, I have been learning to speak this way to myself, to bless myself with kindness. I bless my young hurting boy who needed to be fathered. What often pains us when we look at pictures of ourselves in childhood, I think, is that we see or we get connected to longing.
Yes.
Longing for fathering, for mothering, but longing. I mean, children are a mass of longing. And, sometimes by the age, it's tragic, but maybe by the age of 4 and 5, some people have had to actually kill that longing for connection. But whatever age it was for you, many people have photos before they killed it.
Yes, exactly. And you can see it on their face, right? Their face changes. And what we have to do is we have to realize we can't turn against that longing. Sometimes we turn that longing or that desire into a form of contempt, because we hate that we long so much. We hate that we desire so deeply. And that is a good thing. We have to actually keep that alive. It's a good thing that I desire a relationship with my father. Even now that he's unable to give that to me, it's still good in me.
Right. And that there's a portion in the final chapter of the book where you talk about reconnecting with your father after 6 years of no contact. And he's very sick at that point. And you say this, it's just such a good sentence: my contempt had blocked my desire for my father, but now I could not hold my longing in.
Yeah.
Contempt covers over shame, yes, but far more, it covers over longing. It is a way of keeping desire at bay. And what I heard you confessing in that sentence is your contempt had allowed you to somehow keep your desire for fathering at bay.
Yeah. In some ways I had to keep it in check, right? Because I was so scared. I was so scared of my own grief, my own longing, right? And until more recently, in the last few years, when I'm able to face my father and really make peace with that longing, like that's okay. That's okay to love him. That's okay to receive. And I remember the scene that you're referring to in the book. He's in this home meeting my kids for the first time, and he's got dementia, and I just remember him not really being there, fully there, and doing some odd things. And then when I'm about to leave, he looked me in the eye and he said, "I love you." And he stopped, came back into the room when he said it. Like, he went from this distant look to just locking eyes with me and showing up. And I was just like, oh, that felt real. That was kind of weird. And I actually believed it. And that's where, if my contempt would have been still strong, I would have just been like, oh yeah, well, you never were there for me. Well, you failed me this way, that way. You let me down here. You've been a coward here, which I have a long laundry list of things. And yet for me to soften my heart is for me to enter into my own grief, still tell the truth of our relationship and my longing for him, and grieve that loss, but yet also receive that love.
And I think that so much of our contempt for the younger us is often a contempt for you needed him, you needed her, you needed a father, you needed a mother.
Yes.
And that caused so much torment. If I could make the need go away, I would not feel such agony. And so many of us, even at young ages, many of us found ways to make our need, our longing, our desire for father, for mother go away.
Exactly. Yep. Completely. Yep. And how do we as adult self reclaim desire as good?
And so that's what I love. That to me is what's inherent in the notion of blessing the younger Andrew.
Yes.
You're not just saying, hey, you're a good kid. You're saying your desire and need for that man in that photo who is your father is so good.
Yes, exactly. And that's that wild blessing, right? That's replacing it with, rather than with curse, which I've done for so long, is to replace it with a blessing that actually gives life.
So if we can, I just want to shift back to the grief chapter. There's a section in the Grieving Our Wounds chapter called Letting Our Pain Be Seen. And you've got a sentence in there that I think is really provocative that I just want to just kind of reflect on with you for a minute. You say, if we can give ourselves permission to grieve, then daring, devoted friends will show up. If those people do not show up in your time of need, ask yourself if you are allowing your brokenness to be seen or if you are just breaking in isolation. And I can imagine someone saying, hey, but when I've let some of my friends into a portion of my pain, they didn't know what to do with me. And I felt more alone than ever. I know you understand, like you've experienced that. So let's talk a little bit about that claim, daring, devoted friends will show up.
Mm-hmm. It touches back a little bit on what we talked about earlier. Like, who do you surround yourself with? Are they courageous people who know suffering? That's the thing. Where it's like I've had friends all across the board, right? And it's like some are literally not that courageous, and in many ways I have to let them go. And I remember after losing Brave, a friend literally was just kind of disappeared. And I reached out to him 6 months later and I said, hey, where have you been? I really needed you during this time. And he wrote back, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to say. And he's a pastor. And he's like, all the things I would have said just didn't feel that helpful. And I was like, oh, okay. And then so we set up a time to talk on the phone and I just shared my pain and missing him. And then I just said, like, you have my number. But I'm not going to keep reaching out. Like, I just need you to be with me now. And that was about 6 years ago. I haven't heard from him since.
Yeah.
And that's a common story. It's like, okay, I can't, like, I got more courageous friends. Like, I can't keep just trying to create something that they have to learn themselves.
The invitation of the sentence is, if those people don't show up in your time of need, ask yourself if you're allowing your brokenness to be seen. Now, I mean, we both know there are countless stories of people who do in fact let at least a portion of their brokenness be seen, and they are not engaged well. We can just acknowledge that. But what I'm hearing you invite us to is, to what degree am I letting the safer people in my world see the depth of my pain? And the implicit question is, are you hiding some of your suffering?
Right.
Because for so many of us with trauma, like, the temptation is to, I'm just kind of holding both of my shoulders with my hands, kind of hugging myself. It's to hold that pain close and not let others see it.
Right. And that's that fine balance between, I am holding my suffering back from some people. I have to have boundaries, and I have to open myself up to people. I have to risk. I have to be vulnerable. And so that's that fine balance between your story, your trauma is a pearl. Do you cast them before swine? What do you do with your story, with your trauma, with your heartache?
This brings us back to that opening portion about our grief exposes who we are. I mean, what I'm hearing you say now is that our trauma is a pearl.
Yes.
Our story, our anguish, our agony, our disappointments are a pearl.
Yes, and that's the part of introducing kindness, right? Because I wouldn't think my tragedy is a pearl. If I have contempt for it, it's not going to be a pearl. And yet kindness is like, okay, there it is. I would never choose to have that trauma or that tragedy again, but yet I can bless, I can be kind to my broken heart.
Yes. Andrew, it is a privilege to be with you and to hear.
Thank you.
To reflect with you on the goodness of the words and the art that you've created recently. If people want to get a hold of Stumbling Toward Wholeness, they can either tell them how they can get a hold of it.
Yeah, it's available for pre-order right now, so you can get it off Amazon. Just pre-order it.
And it comes out when?
September 18th comes out. Yeah, really excited about it. And yeah, just share if you guys would share it. And then the film is available on Amazon, Vimeo. And the book, A Brave Lament, is on Amazon as well.
Let me just bear witness to the power again. If you haven't seen this film, it is 38 minutes of intensity, of anguish, but of immense beauty. And here's what I would say. It opens the door for movement. You don't have to be stuck. Right.
And it's not a movie you just want to like pop open some popcorn and sit there and enjoy yourself. And yet it's also not something where you're going to hate yourself afterwards, right? We didn't want to create something that was so traumatic we're re-traumatizing everyone. And so you kind of have to be in a special place to watch it. And yet it opens your heart in a good way. And we want people to cry. We want people to grieve. We want people to laugh. We want people to feel.
This film is not merely for people who have lost a child. This is a film about how do we come to terms with the deep loss and tragedy that marks all of our lives. What do we do with that loss? How do we engage it honestly? And really, how do we engage it in a way that allows for the movement of the healing of the Spirit of God in the human heart so that we can get back into the stream of life? I mean, at the end of the film, you're there with your friends, around the table, having a meal, and you're alive.
Yes, exactly.
And your wife is alive.
Yeah, and it came at a cost, right? It came at a cost, and yet we're laughing deeply because we have suffered deeply. And the two go together.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I love your work, love your podcast. Doing a great job.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. Be sure to visit theplacewefindourselves.com, where you can sign up for my email list and or subscribe to future podcast episodes. Music for this podcast was provided by Rick Wilson. Thank you, Rick. As always, if you found this episode meaningful, please share it with your friends. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.